What would you do if the house you spent your entire life building became the place you were thrown out of by your own son and you had nowhere else to go? Because this isn't just a story about a family argument, this is about something far deeper, something that starts quietly and then suddenly explodes into a moment you can never forget. And it all began in a beautiful, modern house that looked perfect from the outside, the kind of place people admire, the kind of place that silently tells the world that the people inside have made it. But inside that same house, something very different was happening. Something no guest would ever notice, because standing near the door, holding a small bag that looked like it had been packed in a hurry, was an elderly woman who didn't look like she belonged there anymore, not because she wasn't part of the family, but because she had slowly been made to feel like she wasn't. And if you think this moment came out of nowhere, it didn't, because disrespect doesn't start loudly, it grows slowly through small comments, small behaviors. Small changes that you ignore until one day they're impossible to ignore anymore. And over the past few months, things had changed in ways she couldn't fully understand at first. Her son had become distant, colder, more impatient. And his wife, she didn't even try to hide how she felt, always finding ways to remind her that she didn't fit into their lifestyle, their image, their version of what this house should represent. And maybe the hardest part wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were said, casually, as if it was normal, as if it was justified, and slowly, room by room, her space in that house started shrinking. First, it was small suggestions like maybe you'd be more comfortable in the other room. Then it became, we need this space for something else. Until eventually she found herself in a corner of the house that didn't feel like home anymore. And if you're wondering why she stayed quiet through all of this, ask yourself, how many times do people stay silent just to avoid breaking something they've spent years holding together? And maybe she believed it would pass. Maybe she believed her son would realize what was happening. But that moment never came, and instead, everything built up to this one day, a day that started like any other, but ended in a way she never imagined, because standing in the living room in front of her was her own son, not confused. Not emotional, but firm, almost rehearsed, like he had already decided everything long before this conversation began, and his words didn't come with hesitation. They came directly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. You can't stay here anymore, it's not working. And just like that, years of memories, years of effort, years of sacrifice were reduced to a single sentence. And for a moment, she didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because sometimes your mind takes time to catch up with reality, especially when that reality feels impossible. And if you think he stopped there, he didn't, because when silence didn't give him the reaction he expected, he continued. This time colder, sharper, we've already arranged everything, you can stay somewhere else, it's better for everyone. And that phrase right there, better for everyone, it sounds reasonable, it sounds logical. But sometimes it hides the truth more than it explains it, because better for who, and at what cost, and before she could even process what was happening, her bag was already in her hand, not packed by her, but prepared by someone else. As if this moment had been planned, decided, executed without her voice ever being part of it. And imagine standing there, in a house where every corner holds a memory, being told you no longer belong, not by strangers, but by your own child, and just when you think it couldn't feel more unreal, the door opens and suddenly you're outside, not because you chose to leave, but because you were made to, and as she stood there, holding that small bag, looking at the house that once felt like everything she had, one question started forming, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of something deeper. How did it come to this? And more importantly, how could her own son do this without hesitation? And here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect, because while he believed he had just solved a problem, while he thought he had finally taken control of his life and his space, there was something he didn't know, something he never even questioned, because when people get comfortable, they stop checking details, they stop asking questions. They assume everything is already in their control, and that assumption was about to become the biggest mistake of his life, because as she slowly turned away from that house, taking one step forward into uncertainty, one truth remained hidden in plain sight. The house he had just thrown her out of was never his to begin with. Before that house had polished floors, modern furniture, and a nameplate that made people stop and admire, it had something far more real, something far more valuable. It had struggle, patience, and a woman who refused to let life defeat her even when everything around her said it should. And if you think houses are built with money alone, then you're missing the part of the story that most people never see. Because long before her son ever called that place his home, it was just a dream, a distant idea she held onto during the hardest years of her life, years when survival itself felt uncertain. Because there was a time when that family didn't have luxury, didn't have security, didn't even have a clear path forward, especially after the day everything changed, the day she lost her husband. The one person who shared both the burden and the hope of building something stable for their future. And just like that, everything fell on her shoulders, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. And in that moment, she had two choices: break down and accept defeat, or stand up and carry a weight she was never meant to carry alone. And she chose the harder path, not because it was easy, but because she had someone depending on her. A young boy who didn't understand what had just happened, who only knew that his mother was still there, still holding things together somehow. And from that point on, every decision she made had one purpose: to give him a better life than the one she was living. And that's where the real story begins. Because while people talk about success in terms of achievements, promotions, and wealth, they rarely talk about the sacrifices that make those things possible, sacrifices that don't get recognition, that don't get applause, that happen quietly in the background while someone else moves forward. And she made those sacrifices without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, working through exhaustion, ignoring her own needs, giving up comforts she never got back. Also, that one day her son wouldn't have to struggle the way she did. And slowly, piece by piece, she started building something, not just financially, but emotionally, mentally, creating stability where there was none, and eventually, that effort turned into something tangible, something real: a house, not just a structure, but a symbol of everything she had endured, everything she had overcome. And for a long time, that house meant safety, meant togetherness, meant the result of years of effort finally taking shape. And back then, her son saw it that way too. Back then, he understood what it represented. He respected it. He respected her. But somewhere along the way, as his life improved, as opportunities opened up, as he started experiencing a different world, something began to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly enough that it almost went unnoticed, until it became too obvious to ignore. Because success has a way of changing perspective, and sometimes it changes it in ways that disconnect people from where they came from. And the boy who once valued everything his mother did started seeing things differently. Started seeing the house not as something built through sacrifice, but as something he could now control, something he could reshape according to his lifestyle, his preferences, his image. And at first, it was small changes, small decisions that didn't seem important. But over time, those decisions started redefining the space, redefining who belonged where, and eventually, without ever having a direct conversation about it, he began to act like the house was his, not legally, not officially, but in behavior, in attitude, in authority. And here's the part that makes everything even more complicated: she never corrected him, not once. Not when he made changes, not when he started making decisions without asking, not even when his behavior started crossing lines that shouldn't have been crossed. And if you're wondering why she stayed silent, why she didn't remind him, why she didn't assert herself, the answer isn't simple: because sometimes silence isn't weakness, sometimes it's patience, sometimes it's choosing peace over conflict, sometimes it's believing that things will fix themselves without confrontation. And maybe she thought that reminding him of the truth would create distance, would hurt the relationship more than help it. So she let it go again and again, until letting it go became a pattern. And that pattern slowly gave him a sense of control he never actually had. And by the time he reached the point where he could stand in front of her and say she no longer belonged there, he truly believed it. He believed the house was his, he believed the authority was his, he believed the decision was his. And that belief, that unchecked assumption, is what made everything that followed inevitable. Because when you build confidence on something that isn't actually yours, it doesn't just collapse, it collapses completely. And as she stood outside that house, holding her bag, replaying everything in her mind, one truth became clearer than ever: not just about the house, not just about ownership, but about how easily people can forget the foundation they're standing on. And while he was inside, thinking he had finally taken control of his space, his life, his decisions, there was something he still didn't know, something that had never changed. Something that no amount of confidence could override: every single paper related to that house, every legal document, every official record still carried only one name. And the moment that truth stepped into the light, everything he believed would start to fall apart. What if the biggest power you have is the one you never felt the need to prove, and the moment you finally decide to use it, everything changes without you raising your voice even once. Because as she stood outside that house, holding nothing but a small bag and a lifetime of memories, it would have been easy to react with anger, to argue, to demand answers, to remind her son of everything she had done for him. But instead, she chose something far more unexpected, something far more powerful. She chose silence, not the kind of silence that comes from weakness, but the kind that comes from clarity, because when you truly understand your position, you don't need to prove it immediately, you just need to act at the right time, and that's exactly what she did, because instead of going back, instead of trying to fix what had already broken, she took a step forward. Not into uncertainty, but into a decision she had quietly been preparing for without even realizing it. And here's where the story shifts in a way most people don't see coming, because while her son was inside that house, probably feeling relieved, maybe even justified, thinking he had finally taken control of his life and space, she was doing something that would slowly take that control away from him piece by piece. And the first thing she did wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was simple. She reached out to someone who understood the value of documents, the weight of ownership, someone who didn't deal in emotions but in facts. And when she sat down across from him, placing the property papers on the table, there was no need for long explanations, because sometimes the truth speaks clearly enough on its own, and as those documents were read carefully, professionally, without assumptions, something became undeniable, something that removed all doubt, all confusion, all interpretation legally, officially, completely. That house belonged to her, not partially, not jointly, but entirely, and for a moment. Even hearing it out loud changes something inside you, because what was once just a quiet understanding becomes a solid reality. And in that moment, the situation stopped being emotional and became strategic. Because now it wasn't about what she felt, it was about what she could do. And this is where most people expect revenge, confrontation, immediate action. But what she chose instead was something far more controlled, far more precise. Because she understood something her son didn't. That power isn't about reacting quickly, it's about acting correctly. And over the next few hours, decisions were made, not rushed, not emotional, but calculated. Decisions that didn't need to be explained to anyone yet. Decisions that would only reveal themselves when the time was right. And while all of this was happening quietly, away from the house, away from the tension, away from the assumptions her son was still holding onto, he continued his day like nothing had changed, maybe even feeling a sense of control he hadn't felt before, because sometimes when people remove what they see as a problem, they believe everything is finally in order. But what he didn't realize was that the real situation hadn't even begun to unfold yet, because the moment you act on a false belief, the consequences don't appear immediately. They build, they prepare, they wait, and then they arrive all at once. And that's exactly what was happening here, because by the time the sun started setting, by the time he returned to that house thinking it was fully his, thinking everything was settled, thinking he had finally drawn a line and moved forward, something had already been set in motion, something that didn't depend on his approval, his awareness, or his control. And the most dangerous part for him wasn't that he had made a mistake, it was that he didn't even realize how big that mistake was yet. Because from his perspective, everything still looked normal, the house was quiet. The space felt his, the decision felt final, but underneath that surface, underneath that temporary sense of control, the truth was already moving toward him, step by step, legally, officially, undeniably. And when that truth finally reached him, when it finally stood in front of him in a way he couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't control, it wouldn't just challenge what he had done. It would completely overturn everything he believed was his, because the house he thought he owned, the authority he thought he had, the decision he thought was final, none of it was actually his to begin with, and the moment he would be forced to face that reality would be the moment everything started to fall apart. What do you do when the place you thought you owned suddenly reminds you that you were never the owner at all, and the person you pushed out is the only one who has the right to walk back in? Because the next day didn't begin with chaos, it didn't begin with shouting or confrontation. It began quietly, almost normally, and that's what made it more dangerous, because when consequences arrive silently, you don't see them coming until it's too late. And as he moved through the house like he always did, confident, relaxed, believing everything was finally under control, there was no sign that anything had changed, no warning. No indication that the decision he made the day before had already triggered something far bigger than he could handle. And if you've ever been in a situation where everything feels normal right before it completely shifts, you already know what comes next, because suddenly, without any buildup, without any emotional warning, reality arrives in the most undeniable way possible, not through arguments, not through explanations, but through authority, the kind you can't ignore, the kind you can't talk your way out of. And in that moment, everything slowed down. Because confusion always comes before realization, and realization always comes before collapse. And as he stood there, trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit his version of reality, one thing became clear very quickly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something he could fix with a conversation. Because when something is backed by law, by documents, by facts that don't change based on opinion, it doesn't bend to confidence or authority. It simply stands there, unmovable, forcing you to face it whether you're ready or not, and in that moment. The house he had walked through so confidently the night before didn't feel the same anymore. The space that once felt like his started to feel uncertain, unfamiliar, almost like he was the one who didn't belong there. And that shift, that internal realization, is where everything truly began to break, because losing control isn't just about losing something physical, it's about losing the belief that you had control in the first place. And as the situation unfolded, as each detail became clearer, as every assumption he had built his confidence on started collapsing one by one, the truth didn't just appear, it settled heavily, undeniably, leaving no room for denial, because now it wasn't about what he thought, it was about what was real, and the reality was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. The house was not his, it had never been his. And the decision he made to remove someone from it wasn't just wrong, it was invalid. And if you think that realization is enough to break someone, imagine what comes next, because it didn't stop there, consequences rarely do. Because once the foundation cracks, everything built on top of it starts shifting, and suddenly the confidence he carried turned into hesitation, the certainty turned into doubt. And the authority he once used so easily disappeared completely, because authority without ownership is just an illusion, and when that illusion breaks, there's nothing left to hold on to, and in that moment something changed in him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because for the first time he wasn't in control of the situation. He wasn't the one making decisions. He wasn't the one defining what happens next, and that shift, that loss of control, is something most people aren't prepared for, especially when they've built their entire identity around always being in charge. And while all of this was happening, while his world was quietly turning upside down, there was someone else who had already accepted this reality, someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore, someone who had already made her decision and was now simply watching it unfold, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't reaction, it's resolution. And as everything he believed started slipping away, as the space he thought he owned began to feel like something he was about to lose, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't just about a house anymore, this was about a mistake he couldn't undo, a decision he couldn't take back, and a consequence that wouldn't stop here. Because losing the house wasn't the worst part of what was coming next. What hurts more, losing a house, or realizing that the person you pushed out of your life was the only reason you ever had one to begin with, and what do you do when it's too late to fix both? Because what followed after that moment wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't explode into chaos the way people expect endings to look. Instead, it settled slowly, quietly, in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Because real consequences don't need noise, they just need time, and as the days passed, the reality of what had happened started to sink in, not all at once, but piece by piece, because when something you believed was yours suddenly isn't, it doesn't just change your situation, it changes your identity. And for someone who had spent so much time believing he was in control, believing he was the one making decisions, the one shaping his life exactly the way he wanted, that shift was harder to process than losing anything material. Because it forced him to see something he had avoided for a long time, that everything he had taken for granted wasn't actually his achievement alone, and that realization doesn't come with comfort, it comes with discomfort, with regret, with questions you can't answer easily. And if you've ever looked back at a moment and wished you had acted differently, you know how heavy that feeling can be, because no matter what you do after, you can't go back and change what already happened. And slowly, the life he had built started to look different, not because everything disappeared overnight, but because the foundation it stood on had shifted. And once that happens, nothing feels the same, the space feels different. The decisions feel heavier, the confidence feels uncertain, and the silence, becomes louder than any argument ever could, and that silence followed him, not just in the house, but in every moment where he had time to think. Because when everything slows down, when distractions fade, when there's nothing left to prove, that's when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And in that truth, one thing stood out clearly. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had crossed a line. One that separated misunderstanding from betrayal, and the difference between those two is something people only understand when they've gone too far, because misunderstandings can be fixed, they can be explained, they can be forgiven. But betrayal, especially when it comes from someone you trust, someone you gave everything to, doesn't fade the same way. And that's where the real consequence began, not in losing the house, not in losing control, but in losing something far more important, something that doesn't come back easily once it's gone. And if you're wondering whether he tried to fix it, whether he reached out, whether he attempted to explain himself, the answer is yes. Because regret has a way of pushing people to act, to try, to correct what they've broken. But here's the part most people don't expect. Not every mistake gets a second chance, not every apology gets accepted, and not every relationship returns to what it once was, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't anger, isn't confrontation, it's distance, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that simply exists because something has changed permanently. And while he was trying to come to terms with everything he had lost, trying to understand how things reached this point, there was another side to this story. A quieter side, one that didn't need to prove anything, one that didn't depend on control or validation, because she had already stepped away from all of that, not as an escape, but as a choice. Returning to a life that didn't require her to fight for space, for respect, or for recognition. And in that simplicity, in that quiet, there was something he didn't have any more: peace. And the contrast between these two realities is what makes this story stay with you, because one person lost everything chasing control, and the other gained everything by letting go of it. And if there's one thing this leaves you thinking about, one question that stays with you long after the story ends, it's this: when success starts making you forget the people who built your foundation, are you really moving forward, or are you slowly destroying the very thing that made your success possible?